to episode 12 of Japan Foundation's Pop Culture series and the first episode in our special Girls Culture series. I'm Sukumiya from Japan Foundation's New York office with my arts and culture team. Through this special series, we will be exploring topics such as shoujo manga, Takarazuka venue, and kawaii, and dive deeply into the roots of Japanese girls' culture. By the end of this series, I hope you will have come to a better understanding of shoujo culture and shoujo manga and anime you love. Today, for our first episode, we will focus on Japanese girls' comics, shoujo manga. We will learn the history and take a closer look at the styles and the themes that make the genre so unique, while exploring the universal appeal and the influence of shoujo manga. Today, we have invited 4 shoujo manga experts from the US, Japan, and Singapore. Our first speaker is Dr. Deborah Shamoon from the National University of Singapore.
Hello.
Her areas of expertise are Japanese literature, film, and popular culture, particularly manga and animation. Her research focuses on representations of girls and young women in Japanese media such as film, anime, manga, novels, and magazines from the 1920s to present day. Today, she will be a moderator and will give us a short presentation about the early history of shoujo manga in Japan. Our second speaker is Ms. Mia Lewis from Occidental College in Los Angeles. Her research focuses on questions of gender, genre, and medium in contemporary Japanese manga. She is currently completing her dissertation on the topic of feminine themes in boys manga. Today, her short presentation will cover the status of shoujo manga today and the relationship to the readers and to other manga genres. Our third speaker is Dr. Kazumi Nagaike from Oita University in Japan.
Hello, everybody.
Her research interests include comparative literature studies, literary theories, gender studies, and popular culture studies. Her scholarly interests include the analysis of female acts of fantasizing male eroticism in literary works and popular cultural materials. She has written numerous books and papers on shoujo and boys love manga. Today, she will give a short presentation about the reason why shoujo manga includes non-normative expressions of gender and sexuality. Our first speaker is Ms. Erica Freeman from New Jersey. She is a full-time researcher for Fortune 100 company as well as author and manga editor. She has edited a manga for J Manga, Seven Seas, and Udon Entertainment, and most recently, Ryoko Ikeda's epic historical classic, The Rose of Versailles. She has also written about numerous articles about lesbian-themed manga and anime, which is called Yuri in Japan. She is currently working on a new book, By Your Side, the first 100 year of Yuri anime and manga, coming out in June 2022. Today, she will give us a short presentation about the international impact of shoujo manga. Now we will begin our program with short pre-recorded presentations from each guest speaker. After their pre-recorded presentations, they will have a live discussion and Q&A session. So please feel free to comment or ask questions in the live chat. Although we already received a lot of questions from registrants in advance, thank you so much. We will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. Now let's move on to the pre-recorded presentations, starting with Deborah. I will return later for the Q&A session. See you later.
Shoujo manga, as a genre, is characterized by a very dense visual style, including flowery backgrounds and exaggerated eyes. Why is this genre so appealing to girls? Where did it come from? I'll give a brief overview of the history of shoujo manga from its origins in 1920s and 30s girls' magazines through the 1950s and 60s, and then somewhat into the 1970s. This is a summary of my book, Passionate Friendship. So if you want to know more details, please check it out. The concept of the shoujo, or teenage girl, first arose in the Meiji period with the rise of secondary education for girls. By the 1920s, attendance at an all-girls secondary school was common for middle and upper-class girls, and the closed private world of these schools allowed girls to form their own culture, called shoujo bunka. The shoujo years were marked by innocence, purity, dreaminess, and wistfulness. For girls, it was a time apart from the pressures of patriarchal expectations. The two primary expressions of girls' cultures were girls' magazines like Shoujo no Tomo and the Takarazuka Review, which will be a topic for a later date. Girls' literary magazines, such as Shoujo no Tomo, in the 1920s and 30s, were considered the authentic representation of girls' tastes, or shoujo shumi. The aesthetic and narrative features of post-war shoujo manga developed in these pre-war magazines. These magazines primarily featured illustrated serialized novels. The style of illustration most popular with girls was called jojoga, meaning lyrical pictures, that is, illustrations that depict emotion. The artist Takehise Yumeji was the first to create the jojoga style in the 1910s, marked by a wistful, sentimental tone and close attention to fashion. The artist Takabatake Kasho in the 1920s added exaggerated eyes to the jojoga style, along with emotion and fashion. In the 1930s and 40s, the most popular jojoga artist was Nakahara Junichi, who exaggerated the eye even more and added many highlights. And this is the origin of shoujo manga character design. These magazines also included a few short manga, such as this example by Matsumoto Katsuji. Shoujo manga also inherited from pre-war girls magazines a narrative style that emphasized emotional interiority, that is, depictions of the character's emotions and psychological development. The author most closely associated with creating a recognizable prose style in girls' magazines is Yoshia Nobuko, a prolific writer in the 1920s and 30s. Her flowery, ornate narrative style, called bibun, with its gentle tone of nostalgia, lyrical descriptions of beauty, and polite feminine diction, was embraced by readers as an authentic expression of shoujo identity. This narrative style became as recognizable a feature of shoujo manga as the large eyes and willowy limbs of Nakahara's illustrations. The stories published in these magazines were usually about what was called S relationships, that is, close, passionate friendships between girls, as a kind of practice for heterosexual relationships, because dating boys was not allowed in this time period. And these stories are really the origin of boys' love in shoujo manga, although Nagaike sensei will talk more about this in her presentation. After World War II, as girls' magazines shifted the content from illustrated novels to manga, the artist Takahashi Makoto kept the jojoga style of illustration alive. He idolized Nakahara Junichi and brought Nakahara's character design to manga for girls. Takahashi popularized many of the hallmark traits of shoujo manga, including exaggerated eyes with expressive highlights, layered panels, and decorative backgrounds, as well as stories focused on emotion. Tezuka Osamu often gets credit for inventing the genre of shoujo manga with his series Ribon no Kishi, or Princess Knight, but this is not true. As we just saw, girls' magazines since the 1920s included manga. And also, Princess Knight lacks many of the generic features of shoujo manga. As an adventure story, the plot and artwork are straightforward with little reflection on emotion. This is also reflected in the character design. Characters' eyes, though exaggerated, are flat black without the expressive highlights of jojoga. However, the main character, Sapphire, who has both a boy's and a girl's heart, popularized the theme of gender switching, which Tezuka created as an homage to Takarazuka. This manga also popularized a Western fairy tale setting, heavily influenced by Disney cartoons such as Snow White. More than Tezuka himself, it was his protege, Mizuno Hideko, who developed the style of shoujo manga in the 1950s. In the original version of Princess Knight in 1953, which we see here, characters rarely appear in close-up, and clothing and eyes are rendered simply. But after Mizuno started working with him, Tezuka changed his style to be more like hers. Mizuno's series, Gin no Hanabira, or Silver Petals, appeared in 1957, an adventure story about a brother and sister who sometimes trade clothing. The next year, Tezuka published a sequel to Princess Knight called Futago no Kishi, or Twin Knights. The character design, panel arrangement, and tone is very similar, including the oversized ribbon the heroine Lily wears in her hair, her occasional cross-dressing, and the brother and sister main characters. It's in the 1950s and 60s that we start to see the style of shoujo manga appear. And Mizuno Hideko was one of the most important artists of this period. For example, in her series Harp of the Stars, we can see the typical features of character design with large expressive eyes, careful attention to hair and fashion, and unusual panel arrangements. Maki Miyako was another major artist at this time, and here we see how the panel arrangement is more decorative, highlighting the emotions of the character and creating visual interest in a moment without much physical action. Although romance is one of the major themes in shoujo manga, from the beginning there were others as well. Ballet was a major theme in the 1960s that allowed for a fairy tale-like atmosphere, and this manga, Maki's Whistle, is one example. Horror has also been very popular in shoujo manga since the 1950s. Umezu Kazuo was the most popular and prolific artist of shoujo horror in this period. His work uses the typical shoujo aesthetic, but allows girls to explore negative emotions and difficult relationships with mothers and female friends. Mizuno Hideko achieved a new level of more mature storytelling in her series Fire, about a teenage rock star in the United States. The focus on counterculture and student protests of the 1960s elevates the story to a level of sophistication not previously seen in shoujo manga. The challenge of representing music visually on the printed page pushes the art in a symbolic direction. Here we can see one of the distinct features of shoujo manga, a three-dimensional effect on the page through layering. And layering can refer to panels on top of each other, laying dialogue, narration, or sound effect over two or more panels, or laying faces or full bodies on top of or beside other panels. And this is another example. In addition, artists also make liberal use of white space and diagonal lines, with the result that the panels appear splintered or exploded. Because the stories emphasize emotion and are not action-oriented, the composition of the panels is intended to create a mood rather than to guide the reader's eye from one moment of action to the next. The emotive backgrounds with flowers, clouds, or other abstract designs also emphasize the emotions of the characters. The effect is dreamy and nonlinear, which is appropriate to the tone of the stories and illustrates the inner psychology of the characters. The use of layering to create depth is analogous to the narrative attempt to give characters emotional and psychological depth. Another feature of shoujo manga is the use of interior monologue of the main character outside word or thought balloons, which approximates first-person narration in a novel. The result is that in shoujo manga, the feelings of the characters become as important as the dialogue, and the reader is drawn into the inner world of the characters. Fire was also groundbreaking in the shoujo manga genre for the use of a teenage boy rather than a girl as the main character. The assumption in the shoujo manga genre until that point seemed to be that girls were only interested in reading stories about girl characters. But the use of male characters allowed for far more dynamism and sexuality than in stories for girls, or stories of girls as main characters. The boys' love genre first appeared just after this in the early 1970s. Another important aspect of this title, Fire, is the character design of this character who we see here named John. John's glam rock character design is markedly androgynous, with long flowing hair, billowing blouses, and dress-like overcoats. Ikeda Ryoko used John as a model for her character design of Oscar in The Rose of Versailles. She was also influenced by Mizuno's combination of political content with a love story. Shoujo manga developed through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, created by both male and female artists, mostly teenagers themselves. Although the editors were all men, they took a very hands-off approach and allowed the artists to do whatever they wanted to as long as it sold copies. This kind of benign neglect led to wild experimentation as well as sensitivity to the tastes of girl readers. In both girls' magazines and in shoujo manga, the emotional lives of teenage girls are given weight and significance. Thanks, and I look forward to your discussion and questions.
Hello, my name is Mia Lewis, and in my portion of the talk, I'm going to discuss the status of shoujo manga today and its relationship to readers and to manga of other genres. Why is it that this distinction between manga for boys and that for girls has persisted through the nearly 50 years since Dr. Shamoun's talk left off, and what does shoujo manga mean today? As we can see in these three covers of recent shoujo manga magazines released over the past few months, shoujo manga retains many of the hallmarks that defined it in its early years. From left to right, these are the covers of Chao, Nakayoshi or Good Friends, and Hanato Yume or Flowers and Dreams. The left two magazines are aimed especially at young girls, including those in elementary school, whereas Flowers and Dreams is aimed at a slightly older audience. Manga magazines at stores in Japan are sealed closed, and so these covers are left to appeal to their potential readers. These covers embody stereotypical girliness through their prominent use of pinks, purples, and blues, their forefronting of girl characters with large eyes, sometimes with the addition of handsome male romantic interests, and they are accompanied by flowers and sparkles and cute animal or stuffed animal companions. As anthropologist Jennifer Prowl has argued, shoujo manga works to both appeal to girls and to define what it means to be a girl to those who see the products marketed at them in bookstores, kiosks, and convenience stores across Japan. Shoujo manga is also defined in terms of what it is not. And what it is not is shonen manga. We can see here the covers of three recent shonen manga magazines, including Weekly Shonen Jump, from left to right, Weekly Shonen Jump, Weekly Shonen Magazine, and Monthly Korokoro. Monthly Korokoro is aimed at the youngest audience of the three, and Weekly Shonen Jump is read very widely across age and gender groups, as we'll discuss later. So today I'm going to focus on drawing styles, but I do want to note that the covers of many manga magazines aimed at boys and young men center photographs of live female models, and oftentimes these photographs are to some degree erotic in nature, featuring girls and women in revealing bikinis clearly intended for the voyeuristic male gaze. In contrast with the soft lines and cute illustrations of shoujo manga, the covers here are dominated by more angular line work, clunky spiked hair, and smaller eyes with only one highlight or none. The colors are bright and high contrast, and the foreshortened poses like those seen in the left and right examples make the covers look dynamic and engaging. Girls are nearly absent on these covers aside from a few small drawings in the corners, although they are present in the covers of other issues within these manga magazine series. If the covers of the shoujo manga magazines we have seen are stereotypically girly, these are stereotypically masculine. Now that we have looked at the covers, let's look inside manga magazines. To demonstrate the visual distinction between genres, I would like to draw your attention to these 3 pages created by the renowned all-female artist group Clamp. Although the vast majority of contemporary manga artists create works in genres aimed at girls and women or at boys and men, and not for both, Clamp has created a complex universe with story arcs that span series in the 3 most popular genres, shonen, shoujo, and seinen. Seinen is manga created for men. All of these 3 pages, each serialized in magazines in different genres, in the early 2000s feature the same 2 characters, among other characters. However, each are drawn in a distinct style that is characteristic of the genre it was serialized in. So to begin with paneling or the layout, the panels for the shonen and seinen examples are clearly defined, generally rectangular with white space between them and nothing breaking outside of the frames. This style of paneling makes a sequence of events clear and allows readers to quickly progress through the story. The only text is dialogue and sound effects. The focus on action in the shonen manga is evident in the dynamic fighting poses in the top left panel, and when the speed lines emphasizing the desperation of the girl character Sakura in the center panel. The seinen version is rendered static by the lack of dynamic poses or motion lines, and by the thin parallel lines in the central panel that encase Sakura. In contrast with the use of black to shade in the shonen and seinen selections, there's no shading of the characters at all in the shoujo manga selection here. This is combined with the thin line work and layered panels, and with characters and thoughts floating in space, which creates a light and airy quality to the page. In this example, the rectangular boxes are the girls' characters' thoughts, and flowers, sparkles, and indistinct areas of gradient grays connect panels and characters, leaving the sequence of events less clear and encouraging readers to pause and focus on the characters' feelings. Finally, we should compare the eyes. In the shoujo manga, we see large eyes with detailed gradient shading and multiple highlight points. In comparison, the shonen and seinen version both have solid, smaller black eyes with a single white highlight, or white eyes with a single black line in the case of The Witch. We can compare the final volume of the original shoujo manga series, Cardcaptor Sakura, which is published in 2000, with its 2016 sequel, Cardcaptor Sakura Clear Card Arc, which is still in serialization today. And in doing so, we can look at how manga trends have shifted from the early 2000s to the present. We see in both these examples the use of similar flower motifs, a hallmark of Clamp's manga, in particular this series or these series. And the main character Sakura is floating in space, layered over rectangular patterns, with her thoughts shown in rectangular boxes, which are then layered over the scene. However, in terms of differences, the 2016 page gives a cleaner, more simplified impression created by the less elaborate line work in the hair and eyes, and the wispy gray sparkles that are behind rather than layered on top of Sakura. In both pages, we see the effect of spattered white paint over the images, which serve to lighten them, particularly when compared with the much darker shonen and seinen versions. Broadly speaking, the trends in these mangas share parallels with wider trends within the shonen, seinen, and shoujo genres. Shonen manga in particular is focused on action with clearly defined panels and heavy use of motion lines and sound effects. Shoujo manga has a strong emphasis on characters' thoughts and often evades clear linear progression through complex layering and use of white space, as well as characters' thoughts and dialogues that are not encased in panels at all, which often creates a dreamlike quality wherein the progression of time is unclear. Seinen manga, for its part, often features playing with different art styles, as we see in Holic through its use of motifs from traditional Japanese art, such as the wispy smoke seen here. But in general, the paneling tends to be closer to that of shonen manga. Beyond giving us the opportunity to examine how the same characters are represented differently using the standard aesthetics of the shonen, seinen, and shoujo genres, these works raise the question of readership. If the story is being told across 3 different genres, then doesn't that mean that readers are reading works in genres that are nominally not targeted at them? This is indeed the case, not only for Clamp's work, but for manga magazines in general, with specific caveats. In a 2012 survey, only 5% of men and 8% of women said that they read no manga at all. In this survey by NTT, approximately 80% of Japanese men and women in their 20s said that they like manga, as did 65% of the oldest age group surveyed, 40 to 44. Manga is also widely read by children, their primary target audience. Surveys conducted in the past decade have shown that prominent shonen and seinen series are read across genders and age group, and indeed the most popular manga magazine in Japan, Weekly Shonen Jump, has a readership that's approximately 1/3 girls, despite being a shonen magazine. In contrast, shoujo and ladies' comics are read almost exclusively by girls and women. The result is that the fantasy spaces aimed at boys and men are widely being consumed by girls and women, while the spaces created for girls and women are almost exclusively for them. The nearly exclusive female space of shoujo manga readership is reflected in its overwhelmingly female creators, but these female creators are often still working under male editors, although the proportion of female editors has been increasing, and still nearly all editors-in-chief of all manga magazines are male. In short, shoujo manga is an environment created for and by girls and women that is still often governed by men. The division between shonen and shoujo manga continue through the generations, in part through the programs that manga magazines use to train young aspiring creators, with shoujo manga magazines emphasizing stereotypically feminine traits in their instructions to aspiring creators. In contrast, shonen manga magazines' instructions for aspiring readers generally focus on gender-neutral priorities, including creativity, originality, and exciting content. Even so, the content of shonen manga consistently centers an androcentric worldview through having almost exclusively male leads, and through the frequent misogynistic depictions of fictional girls and women, and of living girls and women through the aforementioned cover photos and accompanying interior photo spreads. In conclusion, I want to briefly introduce two recent series that have challenged gender and genre norms in shoujo manga. The first of these two is the series Not Your Idol by Aoi Makino, which was serialized in a manga magazine for young girls, Ribbon. Although short-lived, the series gained national attention for addressing issues such as sexual assault, harassment, and exploitation of high school girls. The main character seen here on the far right is a girl who used to be a pop idol, but after being attacked by a male fan, she refused to dress to please boys and men, instead opting to wear pants and cut her hair short, leading to harassment by her classmates, even as she then stands up for classmates who have been sexually assaulted or harassed. And I also want to look briefly at this comic that was released starting approximately a year ago called Unrivaled Naomi Tennichi, about Naomi Osaka, the biracial Japanese-American tennis star. In this fantastic reimagining of Naomi's life, she supports her family by battling in tennis on an intergalactic stage, competing against aliens. The comic is remarkable not only for its centering of a real biracial tennis star, but also for its focus on sports and a female character supporting her family, themes that have been present in shoujo manga for decades, but have often taken a back seat to romance. Although fictional, this story seems aimed at inspiring a future generation of girls to have a broad idea of what it means to be Japanese, to work to become physically and emotionally strong, and to believe in their own power. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kazumi Nagaike. Thank you very much for watching my presentation on shoujo manga. Shoujo manga has developed as a form of self-expression for Japanese girls, as well as issues of gender and sexuality have become important elements in shoujo manga. As the symbol of this, it's often said that shoujo manga began with Tezuka Osamu's Princess Knight, in which Princess Sapphire is raised as the cross-dressing prince to succeed to the throne of the kingdom. Princess Knight was later followed by a number of shoujo manga works, which accommodated specific narratives, enabling girls to question or challenge socially established gender sexuality norms. In my presentation, I would like to talk about male and female homosexual themes in shoujo manga, explaining such keywords as pre-BL and yuri. I hope to convey why and how shoujo manga includes non-normative expressions of gender and sexuality, and how these works reflect both the social reality of Japanese girls or women and their imaginative power. As Tezuka's Princess Knight shows, shoujo manga has a long history of portraying female characters who disguise themselves as men. This cross-dressing provides a specific means for female characters to empower themselves as pseudo-males. In this way, female characters can transgress boundaries to the male realm which women are otherwise forbidden to enter. The best example of this is the roles of Versailles. The emergence of Bishonen, beautiful young male characters in shoujo manga, should also be mentioned here. Girls' enthusiasm for Bishonen characters can be read in terms of their rebellion against and a fear of Japanese machismo. In other words, these characters represent a female desire to feminize Japanese men or to castrate them. Of course, I'm not talking about real castration, but rather a psychological or symbolic one. The Bishonen figures in shoujo manga thus represent women's dissatisfaction with Japanese men, as well as their dissatisfaction with this society itself. In the latter half of the 1970s, shoujo manga artists categorized as the Fabulous 49ers began publishing male homosexual works in the shoujo manga genre. These included such works as Takemiya Keiko's The Song of the Wind and the Tree, Hagiomoto's Heart of Thomas, and Yamagishi Ryoko's The Prince of the Land of Sunrise. These male homosexual works published in the field of shoujo manga are also called shonen ai, boy love manga. But this should not be confused with what we call BL in the contemporary context. Instead, shonen ai shoujo manga should be classified as pre-BL, since BL was not established as an independent manga genre until 1990s. So my discussion here is limited to shonen ai, boy love manga, within the context of the shoujo manga genre during the 70s and 80s. Analytical perspectives regarding Japanese girls' fascination with shonen ai manga are diverse. For example, we can say that these fantasies concerning male homosexuals reveal a subconscious female desire to escape from the concept of femininity. Women may attempt to nullify their female bodies, and such socially enforced paradigms as female beauty, motherhood, and the reproductive function of sex, and take refuge in the harmonious sphere of male homosexual fantasies. Midori Matsui argues that Gilbert's rape in Takemiya Keiko's The Song of the Wind and the Tree represent a form of passive victimization generally associated with being female. As the victim of rape, Gilbert enables female readers to identify with him, as well as to experience a vicarious fear that reflects their own vulnerability as past or potential rape victims. Expanding on Matsui's analysis of Gilbert as the shoujo's avatar, I argue that the reason that a boy and not a girl is chosen to play the role of avatar is because shoujo can thereby psychologically project repressed aspects of female gender and sexuality onto a male character and identify with this character, while at the same time psychologically dissociating themselves from this character due to the fact that he is biologically male. In other words, female readers can both imaginatively become a boy characters and stop being these characters at will, thus placing themselves in a consistently safe psychological space. However, from a different perspective, shonen ai shoujo manga may be seen as revolutionary precisely because it opens the closed door to the space where women's sexuality and eroticism can be openly discussed by women, even through the means of a boy avatar, as suggested by Takemiya Keiko here. In this regard, thanks to the 49ers shonen ai shoujo manga works, women have been enabled to draw, write, read, and talk about sex in manga for the first time. In this way, shonen ai shoujo manga, or pre-BL, established the foundation for the subsequent success of the BL manga genre, where challenging gender and sexuality norms becomes more significant and visible. Yuri narratives in shoujo manga first appears in the early 1970s. Many early Yuri narratives in shoujo manga are set in girls' high schools. The specific setting of girls' schools provides shoujo characters with opportunities to meet others who share the same value system, develop their individual qualities, and nurture their emotional bond through the pursuit of a common interest and ideals without male intrusion. However, these works generally have rather tragic conclusions, showing that shoujo must eventually abandon their yuri relationship and become normal heterosexual women. For example, Ariyoshi Kyoko's Applause depicts a yuri relationship between two women who become lovers when they first meet as girls in a Belgium girls' dorm, eventually marry, and are destined to become rivals in competing Broadway musicals. The genuinely revolutionary wave of yuri-themed works in shoujo manga occurred during the 1990s, was the emergence of fighting shoujo characters in shoujo manga. The best-known work in this genre is unquestionably Sailor Moon. The two characters who are most favored by female fans are Haruka and Michiru. They look exactly like a butch and femme couple. Haruka became very popular among female fans precisely because she possesses clear male attributes, even though she's biologically female. And this combination of masculinity and femininity may be idealized by female fans. Such yuri narratives in shoujo manga definitely establish the basis for the emergence of yuri manga works in later established josei manga, women's manga, which are mostly targeted at women, not shoujo. These yuri manga works in the women's manga genre include more realistic depictions of lesbianism, such as corporeal desire and coming out struggles featuring mature female characters. So in Japanese popular culture, such portrayals of the non-normative aspects of female gender and sexuality start with shoujo manga. That's all my presentation. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that we're going to have an exciting discussion later. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Erica Friedman, and I'm going to talk about the international impact of shoujo manga and the appreciation and to some extent the creation of girls' culture through anime and manga in the West. I'll be looking at this through the lens of three key series: Sailor Moon, Revolutionary Girl Utena, and now finally The Rose of Versailles. In part because I've been asked also to look at the androgynous characters in shoujo and talk about their popularity with shoujo manga fandom, and also to discuss the localization issues around these characters. You've heard from other speakers tonight about the history of shoujo manga and the changes heralded by the creative efforts of the Magnificent 49ers and the creators who came after them and followed in their footsteps. For Japanese audiences, these creators and their genre-defining characters were able to explore topics of interest to the girls and young women for whom their stories were written. Like YA literature everywhere, shoujo manga touched on topics like relationships, family, power dynamics, gender, and sexuality, among other themes. In the mid-20th century, characters were created who stood out then and remain even now as examples for defining girlhood even as they defied expectations. For Western audiences, shoujo manga was the first time an already existing audience was acknowledged. Girls and women had been fans of comics, had been creating comics since early days, but the Western comics industry persisted in ignoring or invisibling their efforts and instead tended to cater to a primarily male audience. With Sailor Moon's debut on North American TV in the 1990s, female-identifying viewers saw themselves represented for the first time as the hero, the protagonist, a character with power and with agency. And that was key. The impact was a virtual explosion of shoujo manga into a Western market for an audience that had not been served in decades and now couldn't get enough. Of the many features of Japanese animation and comics that appealed to Western audiences, one that had serious influence was the concept of the girl prince. In the mid-20th century, Japanese shoujo manga fans discovered that they were powerful through characters who were modern, athletic, and princely. The girls who admired these characters were in the middle of a social revolution, which was unsurprisingly accompanied by a manga revolution. Manga for and by women and girls explored sexuality, gender roles, and gender ideals, among other things. In The Girl Prince, fans saw characters that reflect the ideals and the lives they wanted and the people they wanted to become. The Girl Prince could embody rebellion against society's assumptions and explore the tension between duty and desire. When shoujo manga and their anime adaptations hit North America in the late 1990s, it was perfect timing. Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball Z dominated the after-school time slots on Cartoon Network. American comics were in a bit of a decline, which left space for manga to move in. Newer bookstores grabbed onto manga as a way to bring younger audiences in, and those younger audiences were more open-minded, less obsessed with classically Western ideals of bulgingly muscled masculinity and huge-chested femininity. A lot of fandom was online already, asking questions about their own sexuality and gender under the guise of conversations about anime like Ranma One Half. It was into this landscape that magical girls who rescued princesses became more common. By the 1990s, the girl princes are noble and charming. They combine masculinity and femininity in a new hybrid form. They were heroes as themselves, and finally, they were able to save their own princesses. Sailor Uranus and Tenjo Utena both stand on a foundation of tragic girl princes who came before them, but neither of them were required to be tragic themselves. Japanese fans look to this new generation of girl princes for escape from the strictly confining rules of gender and sexuality. Instead of representing the tragedy of rejecting duty, Haruka and Utena represented new possibilities by being their authentic selves, a message the newly crafted Western shoujo audience embraced, also with vigor and creativity. As you may imagine, these characters have presented some unique challenges for localization teams. If you've been a fan of Sailor Moon, for instance, you've seen multiple variations of character names, from fully westernized names of the geek dub for Cartoon Network to more complicated issues around gender, identity, and I've been asked to touch a little bit about this as well. To some extent, all translation is ruled by fashion that goes far beyond just how companies transliterate names. Even modern translations face difficulties with spellings and other topics. When working on The Rose of Versailles, I kept a running list of the most common spellings used for characters' names, so as the translation moved from one translator to another translator and then back, accents, hyphens, and the like would always be where they needed to be. But what do we do about characters who never existed or who have names that are meant to symbolize something? How do we spell Girardel? Does it matter? Well, maybe only insofar as it has to match from volume to volume, but Haruka's family name, Tenno, has meaning, but when transliterated correctly, academically, becomes awkward and unreadable for the original intended audience of young people. Here's the 600-pound elephant in the room when it comes to translation, especially of series from 10, 25, 50 years ago. In order to understand the context of the gender issue in these series, you often need to know cultural relics. And if you don't know these references, you'll miss key points in the text, beyond even references to early works that Japanese audiences would have familiarity with, but not Western ones. Consider the existence of Takarazuka. Nowadays, a localization team is likely to be familiar with the all-female musical review performance tropes. In the late 1990s, that knowledge might not have been so common, and that knowledge informs several key shoujo series and the tropes within them. And again, we come back to the issue of gender nonconformity. In Europe, The Rose of Versailles' protagonist was referred to as Lady Oscar, and early translators in English used that. But the text of the manga makes it clear that lady was not only not used, it was not allowed in the Jarget home in reference to Oscar. Haruka uses boku as a self-identifying pronoun. The text tells us again explicitly that Haruka is both a man and a woman. Do we, as 21st century localizers, still insist that Haruka is she? This is a question that every team is going to have to take up for discussion. Both fashion and our understanding of human existence present challenges in translation, but they also offer unlimited opportunity for audiences to rethink and reimagine their own existences using what they've learned from these enduring characters. Nowadays, comic audiences can assume female leads with autonomy and agency. We see female lead comic series, television shows, and movies. But American comics are still catching up to manga. As a result, characters are being created in mainstream American comics that have a similar emotional impact to characters who forged a path for us in shoujo manga. Without Sailor Moon on after-school television, we might have had to wait longer for Star Blossom. And without a generation growing up with Haruka Michiru or Anshin Utena, maybe the time for Harley and Ivy to have their own cartoon and comic might have taken a while to come. Younger audiences are looking for more sophisticated storylines. With so many narrative relics from BL and Yuri having originated in shoujo, audiences from gender and sexual minorities often turn to shoujo for stories they can map themselves into and redefine their world through. Now, in the 21st century, with characters whose existence questions the dominant paradigm as a basis, those fans can strike out and now find stories meant as actual representation in different genres. In 2020, the annual character poll for Sailor Moon was dominated by Tenno Haruka. The importance of these same questions of identity mean that Oscar Francois de Jarget, Tenjo Utena, and other gender non-conforming characters were a crucial part of the paradigm that endures in shoujo manga fandom in Japan and helped establish shoujo manga in North America. Shoujo gave the fandom wings. Creators and readers who grew up with shoujo manga, Yuri, and BL as things that have always existed are now taking to the skies with flights meant to inspire the next generation. Thank you very much.
And girls culture. Thanks very much to the presenters, and thanks especially to Japan Foundation New York for hosting this event, and to Sakuya Mio for organizing it. It's really been great to be able to share this with everybody. So shoujo manga and girls culture is a really big topic, and we can't cover everything, and we're not going to try. We're not going to be able to talk about everything today. If you're interested in Sailor Moon, please look back to episode number 5 and watch that one. And also there are going to be upcoming episodes on Takarazuka and Kawaii, and hopefully other things as well. So we're not going to talk about that as much today. So right now we're going to have a discussion that is based on the questions that we got ahead of time online. So thanks to everyone for sending those in. And then after that, we're going to talk about some of the live questions. So feel free to keep putting questions into the chat. So for the questions that we got in advance, we had over 100 of them. That's excellent. Thank you so much for sending those all in, but we're not going to be able to talk about all of them. So I'm going to group together and paraphrase some of the questions that we got. So the first question that I would like to start with, somebody asked us, are you researching shoujo manga, and how? And I think that we have a lot of maybe younger listeners today who are perhaps students and thinking that maybe this is something that they could get into. And also, I think it's important for us to explain how it is that we are thinking about and writing about these things. There was a bit more to this question that seemed to assume that we are taking a social science approach, like interviewing readers and things like that. And that is one possible way to research shoujo manga, but it's not the only one. So I think it's very important to reflect on our methodology and on some of the differences between a fan response and an academic response in discussion of manga. So I'd like to have everybody talk a little bit about their approach, and I'll start briefly with myself. So my background is in literary studies and in film studies. And so that's the way that I approach writing about manga, is to look at the text itself and how it gets its ideas across. So how is the story told, and how are the visuals adding to that story? And also, as you could tell from my presentation, I focus more on earlier historical time periods. And so I do a lot of archival research. I try not to only read the story in reprints, but to go back in the archives in Japan and look at the original magazines where these things were serialized, which tells you a lot about how it was received at that time period. What other stories were being serialized in that magazine at the same time, what the reader letters were saying, how the editors were talking about them, what was written in the notes around the manga. And also for some manga artists, especially Tezuka, when things are reprinted, they change them a lot. And Tezuka redrew almost everything. And so you don't get to see his original art unless you go back and see those original magazines. So that's how I approach my research. And I'm always thinking about it in terms of how is this addressing the reader? What is the bigger ideology behind this? And how does it address and speak to issues that are relevant for that audience? Okay, so who would like to go next? Kazumi,
It's
go
me.
ahead.
Is that all right? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Deborah Sensei. Yeah, so yeah, compared with Deborah Sensei's, methodology or background, so I realized I'm so self-centered because, I started, asking myself why, Sarah, please share my, title for story a little bit. So when I was reading the song of Tree and Wind, Takemiya Sensei, and when I was 10 years old, so my mother caught me reading it. So she kind of, shocked, and she, yeah, what's wrong with you? So you're such a pervert. Yeah, why you read such a pornographic, erotic manga? So I kind of started having some kind of sense of guilt and shame. So I kind of started asking why I'm so drawn into such a, erotic or homoerotic, specifically narratives. So that's the reason why I started, studying somehow, like Deborah Sensei, I started as a literary studies scholar. But at the same time, so analyzing, literary works, but at the same time, so taking some kind of psychology or psychoanalysis. So, which I kind of presented in my presentation. So why, how I identify with the character, and how I reduce the sense of guilt and shame in order to consume the erotic narratives, having a boy avatar or something like that. So psychoanalysis or psychology is the basis of my, research. But at the same time, when I provided that kind of research result, so I had some kind of bashing from the other scholars and fans. I don't identify with that character, something like that. So it's your story, it's your analysis. I understand that. So as I said before, that's analytical perspectives are diverse. So I kind of wanted to share my analytical perspectives based on psychoanalysis, psychology. So I started interviewing, doing the ethnographic research, interviewing fans and authors, editors, which I don't find so fun because I'm so self-centered. So I want to do it by myself. But I had a chance to interview Hagiomoto Sensei last month. So yeah, that's the first time. Yeah, and I asked, I'm really excited. I asked, you create, Heart of Thomas, Clan of Paul, because you targeted at this kind of readership or something like that. She, negates all of my questions. No, I don't think so. I don't have any targeted of it. Oh my God. So, so yeah, I realized, some kind of, like Deborah Sensei said, some kind of, bridging, ethnographic research and other kinds of, methodological studies like psychoanalysis or anthropology, sociology. So I'm still looking, finding out what is the best, methodological perspective, for me, I'm still studying, researching. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you. Yeah. And manga studies and comic studies, it doesn't have a department or field, especially in English, the way that other fields like literary studies or film studies necessarily do. And so it does tend to cover a lot of different fields. And also, like you said, there are a lot of academic disagreements. Academic writing is like a long, drawn out conversation, and someone will say their opinion, and then other people will disagree with it. So it's normal to have a lot of different interpretations, even of the same text. I mean, we encourage that in academia. All right, so Mia, can you talk a little bit about your methodology, please?
So I feel like, so I also come from a literature background, but I actually began researching manga before I really got into doing literature academically. So I feel like I've been doing manga at least as long as I've been doing literature. And I feel like I use a lot of different methodologies. I go back and I look at archives, like Deborah was talking about, and trying to get a sense for the context in which things are published. I have done interviews with editors and spoken with the teams that work to produce manga. I also look at fan communities online and media coverage online to look at how works are presented. And I also have a really strong focus on looking at the formal elements of the page. I'm always curious about, I read this and I had this feeling, and then I go back and I look at the page and I'm like, why did I feel this way? Why did this page make me feel this way? Or why I realize I'm reading really quickly. Why am I reading quickly? So I think I like to spend a lot of time looking at the page and trying to figure out. So it's this sort of introspective thing, but I'm also really curious about how do other people feel about it, and how are people telling other people that they should feel about it. So yeah, I guess I'm combining different methodologies.
Great, thank you. All right, and Erica?
So I also actually have a literary background. I was in comparative literature major back in the day. And so I also basically approach everything from the original text. As you know, I am not an academic. I am writing reviews and I'm doing interviews, but also I started one of the earliest Yuri publishing companies in the United States. And so for me, it's very much a mixture of being very aware of how the industry and the market and the fandom all interact and how they bounce off of each other and how they have different needs. So the creators, the publishers, and the fandom all have different requirements out of their content. And so that sort of fascinates me. And I balance that with the fact that I've kept contacts in the industry. And as you know, I've managed to do some editing within the industry. So I'm always very aware of how is this going to make sense. A 50-year-old comic makes sense 50 years later. And so for me, it's a lot about the push and pull of the different stressors on what the content is and how it's going to be approached and appreciated by the people who are reading it and also by the people who are selling it.
Great, thank you. All right, excellent. So then moving on in terms of how we talk about these things, we got another question, which is shoujo manga a genre or a demographic or both? How do you define a manga as shoujo? And another similar question, has the definition of shoujo manga shifted over time? So I'd like to talk about how we define shoujo manga. And again, there's no single one answer to this. There's lots of different ways about talking about it. So often in manga studies, especially in Japanese language manga studies, the answer is usually based on the magazine that first serialized a story. So if a story came out in Ribbon or Margaretto, then it's shoujo manga. And if it was published in Jump, then it's shonen manga. But this is a very surface level way of talking about things. And there's additional ways that we can talk about these. So who would like to go first? Mia, do you want to talk about some genre markers?
Yeah, so I think I sort of have always been interested in genre. I first got interested in like genre and clamp like when I was an undergrad. So I think what's interesting to me is the way that fans perceive comics and the ways that one of the things that I've noticed is that if you're publishing something that looks like a shoujo manga, but you're publishing it in a shonen manga magazine, the way that readers perceive those different signs are different. And actually authors tend to use them strategically in ways that they wouldn't use them in the shoujo genre. So if you're using shoujo manga aesthetic markers in a shonen manga, like we might think of as in Your Lie in April, they do that a lot. People often think, even in Japan, that it's a shoujo manga, even though it's a shonen manga. And the way that they use things like sparkles aesthetically in a way that in shoujo manga, they often don't have a meaning. They're just sort of visual flares. So I think that even if something looks like it's not, even the aesthetics don't seem to match up with the magazine it's published in, the readers are perceiving those aesthetics differently. And if you look really closely, you can see that the creators themselves are using the aesthetics in ways that they wouldn't if it was in that. And you can look, the reverse example of My Love Story, or Ore Monogatari, where the shonen manga aesthetics are being used strategically in ways that they wouldn't be used, or they wouldn't have the same effect in a shonen manga itself.
Great, thanks. And who would like to go next?
Yeah, all right. So I had a very, simple definition of shoujo manga. So like Deborah Sensei said, it's, published in a shoujo magazines, manga magazines, and targeted at, teenage girls or something like that. So, but I realized, female creator for shoujo manga and targeted at shoujo women is a basis of the shoujo manga. But I realized like cross-gender reading, so the specific number of guys, started reading shoujo manga in the 80s. So Mia mentioned about it, like for example, Shonen Jump is 1/3 of the readership is now women or something like that, right?
Yeah,
When I interviewed a different story about one of the major seinen manga, editor-in-chief, so he said, "Oh, yeah, we noticed a specific number of female readers, but we don't care," or something like that. So yeah, we just
it's always been like that, It's really unfortunate. Like when Big Comic, which is a men's, seinen men's magazine, the first issue came out in I think 1969, and by issue number 3 they were getting lots of letters from female readers saying, "We love the stories, we want to see more, but please less sex, like don't and even male writers were writing and saying, "Less nudity, please, we want better stories." And the editor said like, "Oh yeah, we're getting tons of letters from women." But then they completely ignored them and continued to have tons of sex and nudity in that magazine. And they just discounted the female readership.
Exactly, that's right. But what I had a slightly different comments from the editor-in-chiefs of shoujo manga magazines or josei manga magazines. So they told me like especially 1980s, when after the 49ers works, broadened some kind of the content shoujo manga. Shoujo manga stories getting more psychologically touching or more, not only fighting, that's, theme of the shonen manga, right? So that's a very sensitive psychological orientation provided by shoujo manga attracted the large number of readers in 1980s, from 1980s. So they said, "Oh, what's wrong with reading shoujo manga?" Because we have shoujo minded. So that's, I like that kind of attitude too. So, I kind of, oh, like a eureka to me. Oh, you are biologically male, but you have shoujo mind. So yeah. Oh, yeah, shoujo manga can attract not only biologically, female, but also, the readers who have shoujo minded or something like that. So that's my definition of shoujo manga. So the readership shoujo manga. So as long as we have the mind of shoujo, even I always told my student I'm forever 25, but I know I'm not 25. Yeah, but I have shoujo mind. So I'm qualified to keep reading shoujo manga, period. I'm just kidding. Thank you very much.
Well, I can't compete with that. But it pretty much is exactly it. I think that shoujo manga is what touches the heart and the mind of the shoujo in us, whoever us is, whoever the reader is. And while I am a little pedantic about, well, it runs in a shoujo manga magazine, but to me, that's really about what the industry thinks it is, who they're targeting it at. But I'm a big believer also in, once it leaves the mangaka's hands and goes out of the magazine goes out, I get to reinterpret it however I want. So to that extent, if, like I say about Yuri, if you think it's shoujo, probably it's shoujo because it touches your shoujo heart.
Yeah, I think that shoujo manga is both it is a genre and also a demographic. And there, I mean, even though we as academics are always looking at the nuances and things that cross borders and that are, because shoujo definitely has influenced shonen and seinen manga. And there's a lot of genre crossing titles, and there always have been, from the very beginning, there's been a lot of genre crossing. But very broadly speaking, if we think of these not as hard and fast rules, but as like Venn diagrams where there's a lot of overlap, or as kind of vague but also possibly permeable categories, genre is important to help us think about how a text is addressing its audience. So all of the visual features of shoujo manga that I talked about and that Mia talked about, that's how girls know that they are being addressed as a readership. And in general, shoujo manga tends to have more focus on emotions and in the inner thoughts of the characters, whereas shonen manga tends to be focused on action. But again, those are just tendencies. They're not hard and fast rules. So
I think it's become a lot more fungible over time too.
Yeah,
we watch the main shonen series and they're crying and they're pouring their heart out and we're getting their inner lives and their backstories. I think it's really melded. They've melded together to become sort of something else.
Yeah. Yeah, and what Mia mentioned with the female readership, that Kazumi also mentioned female readership, this exists across genres in like every culture, because unfortunately it's a fact that girls will consume boys' media, but boys will far less often consume girls' media. And somebody asked another question, why are shoujo manga not made into anime as often, even if the readership is just as big? And again, it's because of sexism, and it's because of assumptions by the animation industry, but also like their assumption is that girls will watch anime based on shonen and seinen manga, but boys will not watch shoujo anime. And whether that's true or not is debatable. Sometimes it's actually not true. It's just the prejudice of the producers. But sometimes the demographics of the viewership do bear that out. So that really is too bad. It really is a shame there's not as much shoujo anime as there is shoujo manga. But another question that we had to follow up about genre, we got several questions about josei manga. So Kazumi, can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, all right. Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing it up. Yeah, shoujo manga is fine. I love shoujo manga because I wanted to like a princess. Everybody wanted to like a princess, but at the same time, when we reach a certain age, even though I have a shoujo minded, I realized, I cannot, become a princess. There's no, Prince Charming for me or something like that. So, and I realized, not only me, but also others. So what is a story after Cinderella marries, Prince Charming? All right. So I still like reading shoujo manga, of course, still waiting for the Prince Charming, but at the same time, so more, realism oriented issues according depending on my age, 20s, 30s, 40s, or something like that. So I would like to read more about, I can, relate to it more like, what is a life in my working, my as a career woman, or, it's what about my husband has an extra footing, extra marital relationship or something like that. But that's the reason why the josei manga emerged, after, the shoujo manga's flourishment from my point of view. But at the same time, from my point of view, josei manga stories still follow the pattern of the golden rule of shoujo manga. It's kind of romance-oriented narratives. Basically, it's it's like for example, latest comics. I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but latest comics, it's kind of pornographic, erotic. Yeah, sometimes really erotic, right? More erotic than the pornography manga directed at males, right? But still, even though no matter what, Doro Doro, it's like a soap opera. It's like a Game of Thrones thingy going on. They find their love. It's like a shoujo manga. So I call it, but at the same time, it's more, it's not a fairy-like story. It's, as I said before, it's more kind of realistic. It's, I don't know how to define realistic, but more psychologically or related. Like, as I said before, I don't know, I keep saying that footing, but something like that, or human relationship problems in workplace, or we call it, kinjo problems. Like that's one of the very serious problems in contemporary Japanese society. How to get along with our neighbors, housewives or something like that. So yeah, I'm not saying that shoujo manga is just romance, but it's a little bit more mature topics, and accommodated in josei manga genre. So from my point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So josei is aimed at an older readership.
Exactly.
And speaking to the concerns of women in their 20s. So, and somebody also asked, like, why are josei manga so much more realistic? Why isn't there so much fantasy? But like you said, like that's the space where it's speaking to the concerns of young women in the real world. And shoujo, the stuff aimed at younger readers, tends to have more fantasy elements. And again, these are not hard and fast rules. Like these are just tendencies. There's always exceptions.
Right.
Okay. Did anyone want to talk any more about josei?
Can I ask a question to Erica? Is that all right? So, you, of course, you are Yuri expert, right? So there is a Yuri narrative in the field of shoujo manga, and the Yuri narrative in josei manga too. I think it's like for example, my lesbian experience with loneliness,
which isn't technically that's a comic essay, so that's even a little bit different. But there are actually, you're right, you're absolutely right. The typical shoujo Yuri narrative is there's a girl, she meets another girl, they like each other, the end. And it usually takes place at a school, and then they often are a girls' school where there are no people around except for those two and a few friends. But there's now a whole group of josei narrative, which is we're calling it shikaijin Yuri, which is Yuri about and often by women in the workplace. Who are dealing with more real life, more adult things, and it ends up feeling very much like josei. I mean, it clearly is josei. It's talking about people in the office place, or people, adult women who live together or have children together, or whatever. So it's dealing with, as you were saying, it's a more, I wouldn't call it realistic, but it's a more realistic interpretation of the kinds of situations So, so in a lot of ways, it's very much josei manga, even if it doesn't necessarily run in josei magazines or anything like that. But it's not the shoujo manga yuri narrative or the kinds of things we see anywhere else. And actually, it's getting really, really popular, and there's some amazing stuff, and it's coming out a lot in America now. So I have to say, I'm really pleased to have seen the publishers here pick up on it quickly, so that people are getting this more adult yuri. But My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness as a comic essay is a brilliant, groundbreaking work. And that's also really interesting because there are now also more realistic narratives in yuri. And that's partially because yuri as a genre isn't from shoujo. It's from shoujo and shonen and seinen and josei. So it's got all these, heterogeneous origins. So every group, has got their own feelings about it and their own stories and their own narratives. And which is what I think, of course, makes it so endlessly fascinating. But yeah, I mean, we're definitely getting more what you would have to call josei yuri, and I think I'm here for it. It's great.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that yuri isn't just like the analog of BL. Those genres really evolved quite differently. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. All right, so I'd like to move on to the next question. We got a lot of questions about what we think of the sexist or misogynist or patriarchal themes that show up in a lot of shoujo manga. And in particular, we got questions about female main characters who are submissive, clumsy, dependent on male characters, and also what we think about depictions of sexual assault or grooming or things like that. So again, I'd like to have each of the presenters give their response to that. Let's see, Mia, do you mind going first on that? Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are always complicated questions, and my recent research has been dealing with sort of exploitation in shonen manga specifically. But if we're looking at shoujo manga, I think some of the questions were like, how should we as readers feel about it? And I think, that's a question in this day and age that we all have to ask ourselves, like, how do I feel about it? How do I feel, am I okay reading it and enjoying it? And is that different from, do I recommend this to someone else? Who would I recommend it to? Would I give them some sort of like forewarning, hey, there's this content? So I think on some levels, it's a personal decision. And I also think that having weak shoujo characters can in some ways be used as a way to get readers to sort of feel like, oh, this is a normal person, I could be this, and sort of to encourage empathy. But we do need to sort of look at the representations of sexual assault and grooming as unproblematic. And I do think that we need to call that out and to be able to have open conversations about these problematics in representation, because I think if we don't say anything, nothing will get done. And I know oftentimes, I mean, the creators of manga aren't really looking to foreign readers, but I do feel like if all we can say, if all we can do is say something, then we should say something. But I also think it's just a personal decision in terms of how do you respond to that. Kazumi, do you want to go or?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I absolutely agree with what Mia said. So representing submissive, some kind of, tamed girls in shoujo manga, it's somehow reflect female, Japanese girls, the women even in the 21st century Japanese society, I think. So we have some kind of, sympathy or, images of Japanese girls in the Japanese society. We can emphasize with this character. But at the and everybody knows that, like Deborah says, everybody says Japan is such a machismo society, even nowadays, right? So even in the field of manga industry, it's more oriented society. It's one of the examples, but symbolizes Japanese, gender structures or something like that, right? But at the same time, so I have been doing the research on a war-themed shoujo manga works. So for it's even, girls presented as submissive, kind of, otonashi, compared with, Western girls or something like that. But they provide something more. They want to escape from the established gender norms. One of the works, for example, they're ordered to work at a factory to keep, the making war weapons, something like that, but they run away. The female heroine of the work run away to meet her beloved one, something like that. Still using 3-panel penetrate. What do you call it, Deborah Sensei? It's like a three panels.
Yeah, like
exactly.
laying
That's right.
the full body along the 3 panels.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's one of the the shoujo manga technique, right? So she's running away, having that kind of layout. So it tells some kind of emancipation and liberation of girl, and it's kind of empowered girl. So it's definitely like Amir says, it's reader says characters looks like so submissive. It's like like old Japanese girls or something like that. But at the same time, so if we have the very close reading of shoujo manga works, we see some kind of the liberation, emancipation of Japanese girls and women in shoujo manga.
Great, thanks. And Erica, did you want to add anything?
I also think we have to think about it in terms of who you and Mia both in your presentations and in commentary have talked about how men pretty much are still the editors in chiefs, and in many cases just the editors. What are the stories that they want to hold on to, and they want girls to see about themselves? So I think there's some of that. I also feel like there's our idea of what is submissive has run way ahead. Otaku generally are fairly conservative thinkers, but I think female otaku, not just fujoshi, but female otaku often are running a little bit more progressive than male otaku. In my experience, this is in my experience, that male otaku tend to want to hold on to the more conservative ideas and the sort of the past ideals of you get married after high school, and then you have children, whatever. And I think to some extent, some of that may be fashion, and some of that may be those male otaku in positions of power trying to hold on to that narrative and feeding it to an audience who desires that narrative, whether they be male or female.
Yeah. So I think something that's really important to keep in mind with shoujo manga as a genre is that a lot of these genre tropes, especially for heterosexual romance, developed in the 1960s and 1970s. So they are really old, and they reflect a much older assumptions about gender interactions. So this genre trope where the female main character of a heterosexual romance in shoujo manga is clumsy and thinks of herself as unattractive, although she's always drawn in a very attractive way. But she's not like the princess of her class, like she is an ordinary girl. This really started in the 1960s. And like Mia said, it's an attempt at identification to say, like, this character is an ordinary girl just like you, the reader. But it's deeply problematic. As Fujimoto Yukari, who's one of the great shoujo manga scholars, wrote about this in Japanese, and she calls this the love trap. So a lot of shoujo manga narratives are about a girl who's clumsy and ordinary, and who is trying to be redeemed by a boy. And so the way that she gets her happy ending is by falling in love with a boy who loves her despite all of these flaws and shortcomings. And especially things about her that are not stereotypically feminine, like maybe she's not a good cook. That's a trope that shows up over and over again. Like she's a terrible cook, or, like she falls down and embarrasses herself at some key moment. And she fails at all of these stereotypically feminine things, but then the boy loves her anyway. And so her femininity is reassured. And so then she gets this princess, being rescued by the prince kind of ending, even if it is set in contemporary Japanese high school or junior high school. And I think that often there is a misconception because there are some shoujo manga narratives that don't fit that. There is quite a lot of gender switching, like we talked about, and because boys' love is such a big popular genre, people expect that all of shoujo manga will have more progressive gender representation, and that's not the case at all. There is a big chunk of shoujo manga that has very regressive gender politics. And like Mia said, like we can ask ourselves as readers, like, do we want to accept this? And also as scholars, I think that it's our place to point this out, and not just to be boosters for shoujo manga or pretend that it's an entirely feminist space, because it isn't. And to point out where some of the great, subversive narratives are, and where some of the regressive narratives are. And personally, as a scholar, actually, I'm less interested in either celebrating or criticizing, but asking, why do these things exist? How is this speaking to its audience? And one thing that I found in my own work also is particularly looking at older things from the 1960s. So I mentioned in my presentation The Harp of the Stars by Mizuno Hideko that came out in the mid-1960s. And it's an incredibly sexist story. I mean, like really like old gender stereotypes. But I saw all of these manga artists reflecting on how important it was to them when they were young and how it inspired them. And none of them talked about the story. All of them talked about the art and how beautiful the art was and how lovely the sparkling eyes and the flowing clothes looked. And so I think that sometimes the readers aren't necessarily paying attention to those aspects of the story. They're paying attention to other things. Or maybe they are kind of selectively editing or rewriting parts of the story that they don't like. And only responding to the parts that they do like. But again, that's not a reason why we can't also ask for better narratives. We should do that as well. So one of the follow-up questions to this was, can shoujo manga empower people and perpetuate gender stereotypes at the same time? I think absolutely it can. And that happens in every media. It's not just in shoujo manga. We see it everywhere with like movies and TV shows and from every culture. But I also wanted to continue this same conversation in terms of queer representation. So has shoujo manga empowered queer communities? I'd like to ask Erica to talk about that first.
So I was thinking about that question a lot. And the answer is yeah, absolutely. Because I actually wrote notes because I wanted to answer this one really well. Because queer folks are so used to writing their own stories in between spaces of other stories, or at the edges of other stories, or underneath, or just glossing other stories, or rewriting pieces of other stories. And because of that, any story that has anything that speaks directly to us individually will immediately become fodder for representation and any kind of empowerment. So we're going to run with it. So like for Sailor Moon generation, actually seeing a couple, a female couple on the screen. That was literally the first time I think I had seen a female couple that was not murderers or victims or, some kind of very special episode. But you had just these two women, and they were just two women, and they're together at the end. And then the story exists around them. And that becomes so empowering in 1,000 different ways. And it still does even today. You see people all the time referencing Haruka Michiru as, wow, they really changed my life. So I think anytime you see a story in shoujo manga or any kind of manga, any kind of media that talks to you personally, yes, even if it's problematic or it's not. If you look back at 20 years later and you think, well, you know, Yukito and Toya, maybe not so cool. Maybe they were. When you saw them the first time, you thought, wow, I've never seen a male couple before, and this is amazing. So I absolutely think that they can both, they can empower, even if they're not meant to be, even if they're not meant to be representative, or if they are and are terrible at it, they could still be empowering if people find something to engage with and empower themselves with.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so Kazumi, I'd like you to ask you to talk a little bit about the Yaoi Ronso.
Sure,
Because
thank
I
you.
think
Yeah.
people outside of Japan are not aware of this.
Okay, yeah, sure, yeah. Before that, so let me say, yeah, I absolutely, oh, is there, yeah, I absolutely agree with, you know, Erica saying that definitely shoujo manga is, you know, pro, you know, LGBTQ, for example, like I provided my analysis in my presentation. So like Fujimoto Yukari sensei, so pointed out in her work, so that kind of, you know, non-normative gender and sexuality have been developed in the field of shoujo manga because, you know, female women in Japanese society is, again, it's going to place as a peripheral of the society, right? So having a male, you know, readers, male man's in the center of the society. So I agree with Fujimoto sensei said, old days, seinen shonen manga is very conservative. It's like, you know, non-heteronormative characters, usually the characters who are mocked, or ridiculed, or bashed, or something like that. But that's not in the case in shoujo manga. So definitely, so shoujo manga has been a leading, you know, media to, you know, promote the issues relating regarding LGBTQ issues. But at the same time, so like Deborah sensei, thank you very much for, you know, bringing up the topic of yaoi debate, yaoi ronso. So it's not always we have, you know, shoujo readers and, you know, LGBTQ members have the harmonious relationship. It's not a case, not all the time. One of the examples, like a yaoi ronso in 1990s, in 1994, there was some kind of, you know, the debate, we call it debate, but that's a fight, real fight. It's not fist fighting, but it's real fight. You know, it's like, you know, fans of Shonen Ai or pre-BL or yaoi manga, female readers have been bashed by, you know, communities, queer communities, real gay men in reality, saying that, oh, you are appropriating the images of sexual minority gay and playing with the gender just for your pleasure. So some of the members of the gay community used a very, you know, harsh word. So you die out, you die because, you know, you doing such a criminal thing. So, but from the different perspective, it makes sense a little bit because at that time, shonen ai or pre-BL yaoi usually feature protagonists as heterosexual. At first, they said, "Oh, I'm hetero. I have been hit by 100 female, you know, classmates. I'm so popular among women." But you are the exception. Or I'm not gay, but I'm hetero. I'm gay. I'm not gay. I'm hetero. But you are so attractive to such an extent. I changed my sexual orientation or something like
gay
that.
For you. We call it gay for you.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. I use that word in my class. Okay, in my classes. Gay for you. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh my God. All right. So yeah. So some of the, you know, yaoi also leading, you know, the members of the queer community, gay community at that time. So say that. So it's kind of, yeah, just heteronormative narratives is mainstream in shonen ai, and shoujo reader didn't want to read the stories featuring gay, self-identified gay characters as a protagonist. So it's just the reason why they said they are just, you know, using, you know, sexual minority orientation, you know, as just some kind of, you know, the gender for your pleasure. So you're not pro LGBTQ at all. So yeah, it was huge fight in 1994. And the second stage occurred in 2007. And thanks to due to an article of the friend of mine. So he used the word, yeah, Ishida Hitoshi-san. I love him. I like him. But yeah, his article is included in the BL Collective volume, which I acted as the co-editor. So with Mark McClelland and James Walker. And
Yeah, that's been translated into English.
Yeah.
So I recommend
Exactly,
everyone
that's
look at
right,
that
that's
volume.
right. Yeah. We still have fighting. But when I spent 1 year in Philippines for my sabbatical, so I had a chance to go to a lot of Comic Cons or something like that, right? So yeah, like Deborah Sensei said, no big fight between Fujoshi and queer gay fans in other countries. I'm not sure. It's very peculiar to Japanese society because we still have such a huge amount of gender sexuality problems. I'm not sure, but yeah, that's the part of yaoi also saying that not always shoujo oriented materials media are not be taken as a pro LGBTQ. That's one of the examples.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's important to point out that BL has been quite controversial in Japan, both because girls and young women are stigmatized for being fans of it, and also because it's been attacked by some members of the queer community for misrepresenting real gay lives and appropriating their culture. But I think what we need to recognize is that when two stigmatized communities are set against each other, that nobody wins.
Exactly.
So
That's
on
right.
the one
Yeah.
hand, I think that some of the criticism within the gay community was absolutely right. That there was more of it. This homophobic discourse within BL. And they didn't point this out, but there's also an undercurrent of misogyny in some BL,
Right.
where female characters either don't appear or they're always the villains. And I
exactly.
think that's
That's
also a problem. But on the other hand, the reaction of a lot of BL creators was to feel attacked and defensive. And that the only thing that they could do was then say, I break my pen and I don't write anymore, which also is a terrible reaction. Like that isn't the most productive way to deal with this.
And there was a reaction also among fandom here in the US where gay folks would show up to BL events or just talk about it, and we're told it's not for you, and we're like, it could be about us but not for us. And I'm citing my own experience again when I started YuriCon, and people are going, oh, Yuri is not for lesbians. I'm like, well, it is now, because that's what we're going to make it that way. And the answer is it's for anybody. It's not for anybody. It's for anybody who wants to read it, enjoy it, and who can find something in it that's valuable. But that's not a message that most fans really understood, because when they found value in it, they wanted it to be for them, and then there's always the cliquishness and other things. So that was a real thing that happened here as well.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm kind of wonder how we deal with some kind of identity politics. And it's definitely, there are gay people in this reality, right?
I remember saying to BL fans back in the 2000s, like, you're acting about that BL the way guys act about lesbian porn. It's not different. And they say, no, it's different. I'm like, it's actually not. You might want to give that a thought. So that would really freak them out, because they'd never considered that maybe they were appropriating somebody's sexuality. Right. And I think it goes around to, was that person particularly mature, or was that person really needy of something, or working out a lot of stuff? Because a lot of people I know who got into BL eventually found other things about themselves that they started to question and think about, and that's cool, that's fine. And I think that's part of that was just part of the process. So it's not so much identity politics, it's not seeing identity politics is what it kind of is, and I don't think it's going to ever go away, because there's always going to be one new person who walks in the room and goes, hey guys, did you see this thing I found? So I think that's always going to be something that fandom will have to deal with. But at this point, with BL so totally established as a genre, and Yuri more established as a genre than ever before, you're not seeing it as much. And I think that's all to the good.
Yeah, Mia, did you want to add anything?
I mean, I think that there's so like basically everything was said, but I think one thing that I think was said that I just would like to re-emphasize is that especially for Western readers, a lot of the time, this was maybe one of the first times that they were seeing something that even vaguely represented how they felt about themselves, or the feelings that they were trying to wrestle with in media. And it can be exploitative, it can be problematic, but it can also be very empowering. And I think there's been some, I was looking at the chat and people talking about Cardcaptor Sakura and some of the relationships are like super problematic. Really just not like, you look back and you're like, that's not okay. No. But it can still feel empowering when you're reading it and you've never read anything like it, and it feels the closest to you that you've ever felt before. At least it's something closer when you've seen nothing. So these works can be really empowering. I think it's why if you look at manga studies in the English language, I swear like more than half of it's on BL.
Yeah.
And it's because people are so excited, that there's this interesting, weird thing going on, but it's queer and it's for women. And I think that, people are excited about it because it's giving them a chance to think and feel things that Western media hasn't given them a chance to. And I think a lot of fans are just appreciative of that, even as we still need to problematize. We still need to, say how could this be better, and how could fan communities be better? But yeah. So.
Yeah, and I know there are some mangaka or manga creators who are trying to do that. I was thinking in particular of Yoshinaga Fumi, who came out of the doujinshi fan community writing. Her first published work was fan fiction of The Rose of Versailles, but she has tried really hard in her titles to represent the real queer community in Japan in a realistic and respectful way. And she's been very popular. So I think that's one positive development.
I also want to do a brief plug for Blue Flag, if anyone
is interested
please. In realistic or more realistic portrayals of gay communities. There's a lot of response within the LGBT community in Japan, actually using this manga as a way to promote awareness of the LGBT community. So if you're interested in something that is it perhaps more realistic, I recommend Blue Flag.
And
I'm hoping that in the future there will also be a BL episode of this series, because there's a lot more that we can say about it. And today we wanted to talk about shoujo manga in general, and not only BL, but also, like Mia said, BL gets all the academic attention, but there's a lot of heterosexual romance. Have any questions?
I think it's related more.
Oh, sorry. Like my mic was not on. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Let me start it over again. So I'm back. Thank you so much. Your great questions, everyone. I would like to pick some questions from live chat. And my first question is.
Your audio is off, apparently.
Yeah. Do you hear me now, audience? Yeah, it's supposed to. Yeah, you should. Okay, so my first question is, So, are the tragic ending of Yuri related to the bury your gaze trope? Like Erika mentioned that Haruka Michiru case is a very rare. Oh, then why? Like, is there?
I think I think so. Deborah mentioned that a lot of the tropes of the heterosexual relationships and just generally how women are seen all started back in the 60s. Shoujo is very, very deeply boomerish. And so we're looking at an older ideal. And I think that manga from the 60s and 70s, the 70s particularly, they just favored emotionally tragic endings. I kind of think it's a lot about it's about that moment of ephemeral perfection that can never be recreated. These moments where everything was beautiful and perfect, and they just die. Like there's nowhere to go from there. And I think that's just sort of it was the fashion of the time. I don't think Yuri having negative endings was any different than a lot of other shoujo manga. Like a lot of shoujo manga just didn't have those kinds of there were some, ride off with the prince, but there's a lot more of these sort of ephemeral things. And it wasn't really until the 90s that manga at all started really genuinely seeing a lot of happier endings, right? You just sort of seeing like an audience going, I'm done with this. Everybody's died. Can we move on? And in the 90s, you just, Sailor Moon just rode that wave. And we saw new characters coming through, this girl prince concept going, I don't need to die at the Bastille. I don't need to leave my kingdom after falling in love with a girl. I don't need to walk away and never have the life I thought for myself. Why shouldn't I have both? So I think it was a little bit zeitgeist of the 90s.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that it was not just the Yuri stories, but the heterosexual stories also had endings where everyone died or went crazy.
Yes.
And I think also this was happening because the creators were teenagers. And like you still see this today, like if you read fan fiction written by teenagers, like there's a melodramatic tendency to really like play up the angst and have sad endings. It's actually kind of a strange thing that at the moment that audiences don't really tolerate sad endings right now.
Yeah.
I feel like we're kind of in a strange moment. Like these sad endings used to be much more common.
Yeah,
nowadays manga, sorry, it's
No,
different topic, but we even though we have a tragic ending in the secular world, we're gonna be born in a different, the world. Isekai tensei mono. And we don't die anymore, right? We can be born. We just keep
and then have a
being
happy ending
reborn,
there.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah,
We can have a happy
exactly.
ending
That's
there.
right.
We can make
That's
it,
right.
we can fall in love with the series I love right now is I'm in love with the
Right.
villainess. So she never admitted she was gay in this world. She is in this other world now, and now she gets
Exactly,
happy
that's
ending.
right. Yeah. So we kind of obsessed with having, bad ending stories. I'm an old generation. I like, I'm kind of romantic that more. Sorry, yeah.
Okay, so next question is about a more like a production side. And how does having men at the top of the editorship affect the outcome, the published work? Difference between the manga by all female companies and then those with female creators but men in control? Like Mia mentioned in your presentation a little bit, but how do you think?
I mean, I know of one editor-in-chief, and now I'm on the spot and I can't remember, but it's one of the manga magazines for really young girls, has a female editor-in-chief, which is the only female editor-in-chief that I know of in the manga realm. That doesn't mean there are more. This is just the one that I know about. And it would be really interesting to see if there is any, to do that comparative study, but I don't think anyone's done it. And I would honestly think that you'd probably have to have it going for a while because, you have the generations of influence and the sort of things that are set in their ways that I think to have a comparison of what would happen would, I think, be difficult. But I do think that there is this sort of sense that shoujo manga are sort of this hyper feminine genre that clearly don't sort of completely meld with the interest of female readers because you have so many female readers who are also reading shonen manga and also reading seinen manga. So I do think that there is a mismatch. To what extent that's because of, this specific person in the hierarchy, I don't know, but I do think that you can definitely see this sort of idea of a girl being represented in shoujo magazines that is not necessarily aligned with what girls are actually looking for, perhaps only part of what they're looking for. But I'd love to hear everyone else. I know Kazumi has also done a lot of interviews with the editors.
Yeah, but I did. I kind of mixed up which editor is which for BL magazines or shoujo magazines, or yeah, I need Fusami with me now. But anyway, yeah, but at least BL magazines, which I interviewed all of them except one magazine, a female editor-in-chief they have. And almost all of them are fujoshi. So I kind of, they understand, what fujoshi, and wants to read, in BL work. So there are good match with, the production size and readers, expectations, at least BL magazines. But I have only one, male editor-in-chief for BL, manga magazines at a time. So he sounds like, you know what I mean? It sounds like a male editor-in-chief, right? Whatever he sells, that's okay. So he's such a market-oriented editor. Yeah.
Okay, another question about a production, but this is about a creator. So talking about boys not being seen as audiences for shoujo, what about male authors writing shoujo today? I think of Monthly Girls Nozaki-kun and how the character presented as a female author. How do you think?
So,
Yeah.
I don't know much.
Yeah. So how do so there is no like a male authors for a shoujo?
But he
There
said he
always
probably
have
has a exactly, that's right.
So in the 1950s and 60s, when shoujo manga first started to appear, there was no expectation that girls would be the authors. And there were quite a lot of men who were creating shoujo manga in that era. And it was only in the early 1970s with what Kazumi was referring to as the Magnificent 49ers, where young women sort of took over and became the majority creators of shoujo manga. And partly they did that by creating the sense that they were very close to their readers, that they were close in age. And so since then, there's been an expectation that women will be the creators. But even then, that's never always been the case. There always have been male creators of shoujo manga, even through the 70s. And today, I think also, Mia can talk about this, but it's quite common for manga creators to keep their gender a secret.
Mm.
Yeah, I think, especially in my understanding, this is even more prominent recently because the creators of manga used to be more public. I know Shonen Jump used to have an annual photograph of all the creators that they would put out every year, and now manga creators tend to be much more private. Oftentimes their gender, their face, really almost everything about them is private, and it's almost the exception that someone would be a public figure, especially among young creators. You do tend to have more people in older generations who are more out in public. But that's just been my experience of it.
It's like the artist of Kimetsu no Yaiba, right? So at the very ending of the Kimetsu, so the author's gender is disclosed as female, right? So something like that, right? So at the same time, like as I mentioned a little bit, the male readers of shoujo manga in 80s. So as long as, the artists have their shoujo-minded readers, no matter what, gender and the sexuality they have, so they are qualified to, provide shoujo manga. So not so much surprise hearing that male shoujo manga artist. So like the same thing we can say, there is always like I'm going back to the issue of BL. So there's a BL and the gay comics in Japan.
Right.
And it found out that, it's BL, among artists and write gay comics and vice versa. So it's it's like a cross gender, cross sexuality writing. We can see a lot more recently, I think.
I think that's true. The comic market's growth has been so enormous in Japan that when I go to Comitia, I can see people that maybe in 2 years will have a really popular series. So I kind of already know who they are. And it's not, I mean, yes, in their books, they're still using avatars and you're not seeing them, but I know I have a file of pictures with me with manga artists, who I've met and I got to see with and fangirl at, and I know who they are. And generally speaking, yeah, I think to the general public, they're going to stay very, try to keep that a facade of there's just this, avatar. But I think when you start getting into fandom and they start making appearances at conventions, particularly here in the West, they start being seen as people. So I think we've seen, both men and women in I think every genre practically.
But I'm kind of wonder, what's the reader's reaction? So some of the Kimetsu fans told me that, the artist of the Kimetsu female, a little bit disappointed to me. So, especially male fans, né? So it's kind of Mia, what do you think after, the artist of the shoujo manga you really favored turned out to be male? So it gonna be such a negative shocking to you, or?
I mean, I don't think I'm personally would feel negatively about it, but I do think one thing I've found is I think that there are a decent number of like female creators of shonen manga, and we don't know about them, or we're just like the Kimetsu no Yaiba, Beastars, and not all of them are out in public. And I think maybe if people were aware of the extent to which there are women working, creating these boys comics, maybe people would start to think about the gender dynamics differently, and perhaps even there would be less pressure that female creators feel to make something that's hyper masculine, because there's this sense that like, if you're not a man, can you really create a shonen manga, even though so many women do?
Right.
So I wish there was more public, but like you said with Kimetsu no Yaiba, I think it is perhaps becoming a little bit more public.
Okay, so since we are almost out of time, we will have to make this next question our last for the question from live audiences tonight. So, this is about outside the shoujo, outside Japan. So, what are your thoughts on original English language mangas or Western-made comics, webcomics, animations influenced by shoujo? Have any favorites? What do you think their existence says about the reach of shoujo?
I think it's great. So I have to admit, I read a lot of webcomics. And I love it. And I think that these apps like Webtoon and Tapas, to me, they feel like the energy that was behind shoujo manga in the 1960s and 70s. Because you have all of these very young creators and there's hardly any editorial oversight. And they're just allowed to let their imaginations run wild and tell the kind of stories that they want to tell. And there's all kinds of queer stories and creators, and lots of different imaginative things, and like a real mix of influences and new types of styles coming out. So I think it's fantastic. I'm always so happy to see these shoujo manga elements, not just like the big eyes, but the imaginative panel arrangement and the emphasis on the emotions of the character. I'm so happy to see that continually being used and mashed up in new ways by creators everywhere. So I still see this all over the place, and I really hope that there will be another episode in this series that, or maybe more than one episode in this series about shoujo around the world.
Any other comments about this?
I agree 100%. I read a ton of webcomics.
Yeah.
I love them. And also I want to say that one of the great things about shoujo elements is the way they're parodied and remashed and mixed up and updated and changed around, where you sometimes can see the actual series. And sometimes you have no idea where they got it, or it's just the idea of shoujo or the idea of a magical girl or whatever. I love it. I think it's fascinating. And I think I agree 100% with the energy is so spectacular, and because nobody is telling anybody how to do something or how they can't do something. It's Tezuka level energy. Like, can I do this? Let's try that. You know, it does not work. Okay, let's get rid of it. And I think it's amazing.
That sounds like very exciting. What's coming next? Yeah. Okay, so that's all for today. I would like to give a big thank you to our special guest speakers, Deborah, Mia, Kazumi, and Erica, for sharing their expertise. For our next Special Girls Culture series, we will take a closer look at the history of the all-female theater Takarazuka venue and its influence on Japanese pop culture. For more upcoming information, please subscribe to our channel or check out our Twitter, Facebook, and a newsletter, which you can find the links in the description box below. Finally, before you go, please fill out a quick survey and tell us what topics you are interested in for future episodes. You can find a link in the description box too. So thank you again for joining us today. Please continue to stay safe, and we will see you again soon. Have a happy holiday and New Year. Yoi otoshi yo.
Bye.
Bye bye.